Hello. We're going to get started. I'm Heather Kostick, Associate Director for the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. Welcome to the Annenberg Public Policy Center. I'm here to introduce our event, Challenges and Opportunities in Today's Climate Communication Space, and our moderator and PCSSM Director, Dr. Michael Mann, who will then introduce our speakers. Dr. Michael Mann is a Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science and Director of PCSSM at Penn. He's received many honors and awards, including selection by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology. He contributed to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He's received the award for public engagement with science from AAAS, the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. And in 2020, he was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and in 2023, he was named Humanist of the Year by AHA. And in 2024, was elected Foreign Member of the Royal Society. He's the author of 7 books, including Dire Predictions, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, The Madhouse Effect, The New Climate War, Our Fragile Moment, and most recently, Science Under Siege. And I will turn it over to him for introductions of our speakers.
Okay, thanks so much. Heather, thanks to everybody for coming out for this event on a nice warm winter day, a little bit of a break from the cold. So let me first introduce Bernadette. Bernadette, who I've known, both Ed and Bernadette, I've known for a number of years. They're colleagues, but also they've become good friends, and they're part of this community of people who have really been trying to advance the communication of climate in a sometimes hostile environment, and increasingly so these days. And we'll get into some of the challenges in our conversation. But let me introduce our speakers. So Bernadette Woods Placky is Climate Central's VP for Engagement, Chief Meteorologist, and directs the Climate Matters program, where she helps the public understand the importance of climate change, science, impacts, and solutions. In her role, she develops partnerships with media organizations, nonprofits, and academic institutions like ours, leads a team that creates weekly local data and other reporting resources for a large and growing network of media professionals. And she serves as an expert on the links between climate change and weather. Bernadette previously worked for more than a decade as a TV meteorologist, where she won an Emmy for Best Weathercaster. Other awards include being named a Fellow of the American Meteorological Society and a Penn State Earth and Mineral Sciences Fellow. I'm very proud as somebody who was at Penn State for a number of years that Bernadette was one of our most distinguished alumni. Bernadette has been elected to the AMS Council, the National Academy Board of Atmospheric Science and Climate, chairs the Penn State Meteorology and Atmospheric Science Advisory Committee, is on the Weather Channel's Pattern Board. It's a program they have that focuses on climate. She's a science advisor for Sea Change Conversations. She also serves on the Princeton Wrestling Club board for obvious reasons. You'll have to tell us more about that. Bernadette, well, some people say that science these days is a full contact sport, and so this is a good example of that. Bernadette also previously served on the Penn State GEMS board and the Watershed Institution boards, the GEMS and Watershed Institution boards at Penn State. She graduated from the great university, Penn State University, with a BS in meteorology. Actually, now it's meteorology and atmospheric science. We did finally get that into there. And a minor in French. So we're so pleased to have Bernadette here with us today. Ed Maibach, again, somebody who really doesn't need an introduction, but he's a distinguished university professor emeritus now at George Mason University. He's director of Mason's Center for Climate Change Communication. Ed, with Tony Lasarowitz, years ago produced one of the most influential studies in the entire field of climate communication, the Six Americas study. Many of you have heard of that, and Ed was one of the 2 brainchilds of that very influential study that has informed sort of really how we go about communicating climate. His research focuses on understanding and promoting public engagement in climate change. Previously, Ed served as Associate Director of the National Cancer Institute and as a worldwide director of social marketing at Porter Novelli International. So Ed came out of the world of public health, where there are sort of very similar, and today, of course, we see that with COVID-19, with vaccines, very similar communication challenges, and really brought this wealth of knowledge that he and his colleagues had sort of developed in that space to the sort of the challenge of climate communication. So we're so lucky that Ed decided to join the world of climate communication. Ed was recently identified by Reuters as the most influential scientist working on climate change in an American public university. He was awarded the Beck Family Medal of Excellence in Research and Scholarship, Mason's top research honor. He holds a BA in psychology from UC San Diego, a master's in public health from San Diego State University, and a PhD in communication science from Stanford University. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, and serves on the board of the Global Climate and Health Alliance. And so we're very fortunate here to have both of these distinguished climate communication experts here today to have this conversation about the challenges and opportunities in today's climate communication space. So without further ado, we'll start our discussion then. Thank you. Okay, so I've got is this on? Yeah, great. So I've got a set of questions that I was going to ask, but there'll be follow-up. I'm hoping that it'll be sort of interactive, more of a conversation than just sort of canned Q&A. But let's start out by talking about the role of a term actually that Ed uses, pluralistic ignorance, and another interesting term, the spiral of silence that results from the gap between what people actually think about climate and what they think others think about climate. So talk about those challenges and maybe a little bit about how we surmount them. We'll maybe start with Ed.
But first, a little side comment on Bernadette's CV, because I didn't know about your role on the Princeton's wrestling board, which is totally awesome. But I did know that you are fluent in French, and I didn't know it was because you had a French minor in college. So for those of you who don't believe anything we learn in college sticks, I would like to offer up the following story. Bernadette and her husband are at the Tour de France. They're somewhere, I'm not sure where they're in the mountains.
In the Alps.
And in the Alps, and a limousine pulls up right in front of her, and out of the limousine pops out Emmanuel Macron, and Bern does not miss a beat. She addresses the president of France in fluent French, and she had apparently what was a very engaging conversation before he finally figured out, oh, she's actually an American. So yes, sometimes we learn things in college that really prove to be incredibly important later in life.
Lifelong learning.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the combination of your sort of weather, background and the French major, it reminds me a bit of Groundhog Day with the one of the lead characters. So French poetry, I think, major.
Okay, so I am a communication scholar. That's my focus. My niche has been in the field of public health, focusing on how to use communication as an asset to address the world's biggest public health challenges, of which climate change is the only one that I've been focused on for the past 18 years. Trust me, that the current measles epidemic has me chomping at the bit to get back into some other work I had done in the past, but nevertheless, what I focused on is how to use communication to address public health challenges, and climate change is the biggest public health threat that human civilization currently faces. I would actually take a step further, and I'll just go ahead and say it now. I think that our continued burning of fossil fuels is the #1 public health challenge that human civilization faces. And little known fact, even among my public health colleagues, air pollution is currently the leading preventable cause of death and illness in the world today. Take all of the other public health impacts of climate change off the table. Just look at air pollution alone. It is number one. It is the leading killer and poisoner of human potential in the world today. So this is why I've spent the past 18 years working on it. As a public health communication person, I have learned that the first, but only the first step in the challenge is to win the battle of hearts and minds. If people don't support what you are doing with your policies, they will eventually rebel against you, whether it's voting you out of office or whether it is bringing whistles to guard members of your community who are being captured and deported. You need to win the battle of hearts and minds. On the issue of climate change, and this may come as a surprise to you, we have already won the battle of hearts and minds. Give or take, 7 out of 10 Americans are worried about climate change. They don't really have a very good understanding of it, but what they do understand has led them to conclude, this sounds really bad. I'm not for this, and what I am for is actually like these people that I give my vote to, these people that we elect or appoint to make collective decisions for us. I don't think they're getting the job done. So in a very real sense, we've won the battle of hearts and minds, but very few of us know that. So while 7 out of 10 Americans are worried about climate change, they think they are in a small minority. And that thus born the jargon term, pluralistic ignorance. We don't understand that we are in the majority, and because we think we, climate-concerned Americans, because we think we're in a minority, we tend to be silent. We tend to be reluctant. We tend not to speak up and speak out to make clear what we think needs to be, collectively, what we need to do about this problem. So the pluralistic ignorance feeds this other term that Mike just introduced, the spiral of silence. The fact that as we become reluctant, more and more reluctant to speak about the issue publicly because we think we're in the minority, then we become more and more reluctant to speak about the issue publicly because we hear less and less about the issue discussed in public dialogue. We see, and now in 2026, for the past 4 years, I believe it is, we've seen a really significant decline in public reporting about climate change. This is not my research, but I think the number is like 38 or 40%. Max Boykoff's research at University of Colorado, a really profound decline in the rate at which our news media is reporting on it.
I can confirm that from the front lines, as I'm sure Bernadette can as well.
I want you to be able to finish what you're saying, but we can come back to that because nationally and globally, yes. Locally, no. There is a difference there. So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
And that leads us to solutions, which is the point of the conversation today. So thanks, Bernadette. And so as we hear, I can tell you also that Tony Leiswitz and I have been tracking in our climate change in the American Mind surveys, how frequently do you hear your friends, families, and coworkers talking about global warming? We have seen that on a 10-year decline now, a really profound drop in the rate at which Americans tell us they're hearing among members of their closest members of their social network, they're hearing this issue discussed, which just further, accelerates that spiral of silence. So there is a climate silence in America. It is very real. We've been tracking it for a long time. We've been working to try to turn it around. Unfortunately, there are other forces, a whole variety of other forces that are accelerating it in the downward direction. When we're not willing to talk about our problems, it's really hard to have adult conversation about what we want to do about those problems.
A quick comment here. So when it comes to climate science, there are positive feedbacks, although we know that that can be a problematic term because it sounds good, but it's bad, amplifying feedbacks. And that is true as well, not just with climate science, but climate silence, amplifying feedbacks that, this vicious spiral that you talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, so when I am brought, as many of you in this building know, and you're doing a lot of work on this, mis and disinformation right now, so they're in a lot of conferences and whatnot, there are panels on mis and disinformation, and whenever I'm brought on that for climate change, I immediately go to his research and Tony's research on public opinion, because to me, that is the biggest piece of misinformation in the world of climate change, because everything you do comes from that understanding of what people think. And as we know, the golden rule of all of communication is knowing your audience. So when you think they don't care, when you think they're not interested, how you enter any version of a conversation or communication is going to be mismatched with where they actually are. And it's going to come from a lower level. Whereas if we understand that people genuinely do care about this and have questions, you're going to enter every piece of communication and engagement differently. And that's something we do a lot of with journalists and other climate communication groups is helping them understand the audience. And that if you go, for those who haven't gone through their research yet, I know many of you here are well aware of it, but anyone who hasn't, and you go to Climate Change of the American Mind, and you go through the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, how they've downscaled this on 30-some questions now at this point, and the variations of where people are on these topics, the one that stands out to me the most is always the one about educating on the causes, consequences, and solutions, because that number across the country is well up in the 70s. And with all the culture wars, with everything going on in society nowadays.
Solutions in the next question.
Okay, so I won't do that. But with all the culture wars going on nowadays, right? It's that concept still of hands off my kids and hand off schools and all the books being banned and everything. And still, that is showing you that people have questions. They are concerned. They don't know what to do. They don't know what it means. So to me, that one stands out the most of why we need to do this work.
Great. I mean, and that leads to the next question. So let's move forward with that. So I often talk about the importance of urgency and agency when communicating about climate. Talk about agency and solutions messaging. Talk about the balance needed in communicating both the progress we're making, because that's so important, but also the insufficiency of current policies alone, and walking that, the balance between those two things. Whoever wants to start first.
Sure. Well, I'll start with a quote from another one of our dear friends who's been here, Katherine Hayhoe. It's connecting the head with the heart with the hands. And we're at a point in my view, that we need it all. We need people to understand how serious things are. We can't ignore that. And there is a big push in being hopeful that is also needed. But to me, it's not an either or, to your point of we have to really, with that, it gets challenging because you want to do it in an empowering way, but without overwhelming people. But what we're dealing with is not good. It's not good at all. And we shouldn't pretend that it is on the impact side, right? However, at the same time, and this is where two things are happening at once, there's so much happening on the solution side, and you can have both, right? And so we need to figure out ways to toggle all of that and bring that into our conversations, our storytelling, whatever it may be. And it's that journey. And when you actually have people getting to the point of, what can I do? And overwhelmed. So you've gotten over the winning the hearts at that point. They're at a point to be activated. So there's different people at different scales of this, right? But we do need people to understand how serious this is. We cannot ignore that. And we have to guide them toward what can be done.
Great. And we'll sort of also get into sort of doomism and despair in the next question.
And just to add to what Bernadette said, climate change is complicated. There's no question about it. That's one of the reasons why people feel so reluctant to talk about it. They know there are experts like Michael Mann out there in the world, and they know they think that most other people know more than they do, and they are reluctant to open up their mouths and engage in conversation for two reasons. One is they don't want to antagonize people who may hold different views than their own. And two is, more than anything, they don't want to be shown to be a fool by not understanding or by having misinformation and having it shoved into their face. So there are really good reasons why people are reluctant to engage in conversation. most fundamentally that it is complicated, and we know it's complicated, and most people understand very little about it, including, and this is the relevant part to your question, they don't really understand what we should be doing about it. When I ask people, both in just my daily life, like meeting a stranger, a taxi driver, or what have you, engage in conversation, I try to find out what they think about it, what they know about it, what if anything, they'd like to see us do about it, and what they're doing about it. And people, I'll just say 9 out of 10 times, I'm making this up, but it's more or less accurate, 9 out of 10 times what they're doing about it, those people who are climate concerned, what they tell me they're doing about it is they're working extra hard to be good about recycling. Great, that is a personal virtue. I really believe in it, even though most of the stuff that I recycle, I'm sure just ends up in the landfill. I still think it's virtuous and I do it, and I'm glad that other people try to do it too. But the point I'm trying to make is they don't understand what are the highly consequential acts that we collectively should be taking, and the connection of that to what each of us as individuals can do to make it more likely that we collectively will take those highly consequential acts, put in place policies that will actually lead to a better future that we want our children and our grandchildren to grow up in.
Yeah, I have to gratuitously mention the work of our own Allie Sinclair, who's a postdoc here starting as a faculty position at Rice, I think next fall, this summer, yeah. And so Allie was the first author on a study last year about that shows the misalignment between the actions people think make a difference and the actions that actually make a difference. And so that sort of paints the way towards, one mode of making progress is aligning those things better. I wanted to also add another point. I've long felt that the real objective of climate denial propaganda and the echo chamber of climate denialism and solutions denial in the conservative media, the intent of that is to create that gulf between the difference between those two numbers, the people that are concerned about climate change and what percentage of the public most people think is concerned about climate change, and maintaining that gulf because it chills the discourse. If you think you're going to antagonize your neighbor, your schoolmate, what have you, by talking about climate change, you're probably not going to do that. So I think that has been the primary intent of climate denial propaganda, is to create that gulf. I'm interested in your thoughts.
100%. And let's not overlook the importance of emotion, how emotion animates cognition. We feel first and then we think. And so when we become convinced that the dangers of us opening up our mouths and actually articulating what we believe is happening in the world and what we'd like to see done about it, if the danger of that is somebody's about to jump all over us, and try to take us down, not literally but metaphorically, we tend to be reluctant to speak up, and thus the spiral of silence winds further and further down.
And the other irony there is that most of us are conflict averse, but some of us are not. And I think that actually breaks down along the same spectrum as opinion on climate. Well, let's go to our next question, which is related to this question about solutions messaging and urgency and agency. What do you say, and I think we all encounter it these days, what would you say to folks who have fallen victim to doomism? How do we help them out of this hole of despair?
It's a great question, and I think all of us go through it at some, depending on the day and what's going on in the world. So it's
not entirely unreasonable at times, right?
No, and it's very real. And there's two things I have to say to this. There's a lot more we can get into, but two big things I want to say is, one, that means you're still human, right? That you still feel and you still care. So don't ignore that. That some forces want us not to care anymore. So even though it can hurt a lot, that means you're human. And so you have the power to do something about it. And that's where I go to some of the most simple things you can do end up being the biggest, is getting involved somehow. And this is where using your voice, starting a conversation, bringing something up somehow, or getting involved in some version of a climate action group. It could be small, it could be big, but we're the ones that need to drive the change. I know we can get into all the policy discussions. I do think there's a lot of blocks to that right now, but also a lot of policy changes come from cultural changes. And so if we're the ones who care and we're the ones that want to do something, I'm not saying we all have to take on the entire world, but I always bring this example of Greta Thunberg was one person. And she started an entire youth movement, not even with her voice, with a sign. That was her communication, right? So one voice can make a difference, and starting will give you this sense of pride and power that you can then build upon.
Yeah, one thing that's sort of interesting about Greta was that, her, and she's very open about, she's on the spectrum, of autism, and that was her superpower. And yet we've also seen climate villains where autism and the belief that basic emotions, basic notions like empathy are, and I was thinking about that, Bernadette, as you were talking about, the importance of emotion and this idea that empathy is a bad thing, which, if you can convince people that empathy is a bad thing, you can convince them of all sorts of very dangerous notions.
I want to riff on Greta for a moment, who I know you know, right? You know Greta.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. But we did in our, we used our public polling data, climate change in the American polling data, and in a whole series of polls, we ask essentially a question about how familiar people are with different climate communicators in our world. One of those climate communicators was Greta. And what we learned is that the more familiar a random cross-section of American adults were with Greta Thunberg, the more likely they were to be taking actions and to support policy action. And we did some sophisticated statistical analysis which showed actually the impact of being familiar with who Greta is and what she is doing. The way that it worked to influence us is the more people were familiar with Greta, the more they had a sense of collective efficacy. Warning, I know lots of nerd terms. Collective efficacy is a nerd term that basically means belief in our ability collectively to solve our collective action problems. And so seeing this shy, withdrawn, but absolutely determined, at the time, 15 or 16-year-old Swedish kid sitting out in front of the parliament, protesting every Friday, the more people saw that and saw the impact she was having on the world, the more it gave them a belief that, hey, if she can help, I can help too. Together, we can lock arms and actually make a difference in solving this problem, which comes back to your question about doomism. And so I just want to say one more thing about that. And now I'm about to make gesture with my arms in ways to take the microphone away. I am convinced that our climate is going to hell in a handbasket pretty quickly. It's on a downward trajectory. We are, in terms of the stability of our climate, in which human civilization arose over the past 10 or 15,000 years. Okay, so that's the part that I struggle with and gives me a sense of impending doom. On the other hand, there's the other trend, the trend that Joe Rome is always talking about, and that is the clean energy trend. We are decarbonizing this world, or we have the potential to decarbonize this world at an unbelievably fast rate. And come back to what I said earlier about the fact that the continued use of fossil fuels is our #1 public health problem. It's also our #1 problem in a whole variety of other categories that people care deeply about, including, by the way, affordability. And so it really is, as I've come to see it, it's a race between the rapid decline in the stability of our climate and the race to the inevitability that we're going to win on decarbonizing the global economy. The question is, how fast can we get there, and what do we need to do to make it happen as fast as possible?
Yeah, and I would just add one point, which is really important when it comes to the issue of efficacy, and understanding what the science actually says. There's some good news in the science of the last decade or so, which has led to the conclusion that the warming of the planet basically stops when we bring carbon emissions to zero. For a while, we didn't think that was true. We thought that there was additional committed warming because of the sluggishness of the oceans, but the more sophisticated and comprehensive climate system models that are used today, which more fully represent the role of the carbon cycle, the ability of the oceans to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, what they show is that the warming actually stops when we reach zero emissions. And so that means that there is a direct and immediate consequence of our efforts to decarbonize our world. And it means that the obstacles aren't political, they're not physical, they're not technological, and Joe's work speaks to that. We have the technology to decarbonize our world. They're political, and political obstacles can be overcome. Okay, well, and along those lines, now let's go from back towards sort of despair and doom here. I want to talk about the challenges of the current media landscape, and those challenges become more apparent literally with each day when it comes to climate and when it comes to a host of things. So talk about the current challenges, the challenges of the current media landscape and how we overcome them.
We could have a couple of hours on this. So the most obvious is people losing their job. Media, the way it was funded, organized, all the past is so dramatically changed. It's continuing to change. AI is going to change it even more at an even more dramatic pace, which seems really overwhelming. So how people get paid, function, and are able to deliver stories is just being pulled away from them. In the past, there was a lot of work done on making people aware that this was an important story or how it connected to stories they were already doing. A lot of that work's done. It's people don't have the resources in any version of a newsroom right now that limits their ability to storytell. And we'll take TV, for example. I mean, what used to be a shift with a lot of time in between is now constantly recording something the entire time with fewer people and fewer resources. We know that print has gone the way of digital and again is overwhelmed with so many different outputs and mechanisms. Radio shifting to podcasts, which is everywhere. I mean, it is just so dramatically changing. And the overriding theme is fewer and fewer resources, from funding to people in spaces to help you. So that's the biggest thing. Often these groups want to do this work. They just don't have the capacity to do it. So that's the biggest thing. The thing I would say, though, in all of that is even though the way we're consuming information is in this revolution and transformation right now, and we don't know where it's going to land, people still want information. And storytelling will always exist in some form or another. A lot of the news people from journalism side who have lost their role officially in an outlet or an organization have popped up on Substack or on social media in some form. They're branching that line of creator/influencer. They are using many different formats to get their information out. So the people themselves who are storytellers and getting information to you will continue to exist and evolve. It's going to be there. And we talk often about kids. I want to add this aspect too, because so many people are, oh, kids don't watch the news or anything. Kids are looking for information. The only real form they have anymore is social media. We don't have newspapers sitting around on our tables the same way. I mean, some people do, but it's just not as obvious or in front of them. The local news isn't on in the same sort of formats with the schedules of kids nowadays. So we often put this on kids of not wanting it. They're looking for it. It's just that's the only form they have right now. So it continues to change, but there really are opportunities in this transformation.
Yeah, I actually want to make a very quick remark about that, because this is something I think about a lot right now, the importance of social media, particularly for the younger generation, and the rate at which social media platforms, for that very reason, are being bought out by tech oligarchs, who actually often are aligned with, fossil fuel interests and petrostates. And to me, that's a very concerning trend for precisely the reason.
Oh, yeah.
So just to repeat it, because I believe in the value of repetition, I am a communications scientist. That is what I was trained to be, and that is what I've done for a long time now. but I'm incredibly humble as a communication scientist because I've learned, like climate change, which is very complicated, people are very complicated, society is very complicated, and the role that communication plays in influencing people in society is really complicated. And the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. But the one thing I'm absolutely certain of about communication is there really is a formula by which communication sometimes changes the world. And that formula is simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted and caring voices. The media, one of my running buddies said after our run on Sunday, God, we need a man like Walter Cronkite again. And it's like, oh, if only it were that simple. You know, at one time, the media was one of the most trusted sources in America, and there was relatively fewer voices in the media. Right now, the media is, our trust in the media, our surveys show, is way low and is highly polarized and is highly fractured, so lots of voices all competing for increasingly small shares of the market. So the media, the news media, it just isn't as influential as it used to be.
And also the world of science, you know, it was Carl Sagan. So many of us learned about and learned to love science because of this one individual. And I sometimes wonder, in this environment, could Carl have the sort of influence that he had back then?
Maybe it's Rain, what's Rain's last name?
Wilson.
Yes.
Rainn Wilson. Maybe Rainn Wilson is the next Carl Sagan in a weird sort of way. Sorry, that was a conversation over in the prior hour. But so the point I want to make is, yeah, the news media environment with regard to reporting on climate change or anything else is increasingly less important and less present. And it is what it is. And Bernadette, Mike gave us the questions. Literally, we saw the questions he was going to ask us when we sat down at the table. So I know what his next question is. And Bernadette and I, in response to his next question, is to talk about this great success story she and I have helped to engineer. But the point I want to make before we get there is that the opportunity we have now, I think, is less tied to the news media and more tied to activating other trusted voices in society with simple, clear messages. And I can talk more about that later. Well,
Segue right to that next question. Yeah.
Okay, well, the segue. All right, the segue. So Bernadette and I have known each other for a very long time. We are very good friends. We worked together in the trenches for 10 years trying to activate the trusted voices of TV weathercasters to report on the local impacts of global climate change. And the reason we do that is because Tony Leiserowitz in my surveys showed that the public, back when we started this project in 2009, the public told us they trust TV weathercasters more than almost any other institution or group of professionals in America with regard to their views about global warming. And when we published that survey finding, a local TV meteorologist in the Washington area, Joe Whitty, called me up and said, "Oh my God, I had no idea I was trusted on this topic. I want to come and talk to you." And he came and he basically laid out this whole vision of activating he and his 2,000 colleagues across America as trusted local climate communicators, at which time Bernadette was a practicing one of exactly that. But we worked together, we wrote a grant proposal, we learned that half of America's weathercasters said, wow, I would really like to do that. I would really like to educate my viewers about the local impacts of climate change, and virtually none of them were doing so through their on-air platform, their biggest, most prominent way in which they reach out and touch members of their community. This was about the time when Bernadette joined our team, but the point I wanted to make is that this program that she and I and our teams built, Climate Matters, was all about helping that 50% of the broadcast meteorology community actually go beyond having their hearts and minds, the fact that they wanted to be relevant, and working to support them to actually be relevant, to change their behavior, change the way they report, so that to put extreme weather and other seasonal events that occur in their community and put it in the context of global climate change. And Bernadette, would you be willing to talk about how successful that project has been?
Sure. So It has come a long way, and it's still one, it is a functioning program that anyone can sign up for. If you go to climatecentral.org, you can find the newsletter from the newsletter section, sign up for Climate Matters. We still produce weekly content, free open access data that's localized to 240 cities around the US, so to help you with your communication. So when we were starting, it wasn't just that people weren't doing it. There were some TV meteorologists who were actually a barrier to the public understanding because there was some working against it. So there was some work really needed to be done during those early days of breaking down those barriers.
When Penn State played some role, the university where the department I used to teach in, there were a number of climate contrarians on the faculty who actually created a whole generation of skeptical meteorologists.
And I'm a Penn State alum, and so I've lived through this on many different levels now. So in this, it was really working with people, and this is something anyone can take with them as you're moving forward, is listening and working with people. Where are their barriers? Where are their blocks? What are they not understanding? Not just assuming some big thing, because many of them, it turned out, weren't against climate change. They just didn't have their own trusted resource. They were being contacted by the Heritage Foundation. They also are, if you think about it, one of the most attacked professions out there because they're always told they're so wrong, and they don't have a script. So if they're talking, they want to feel confident in what they're talking about, and they identify as scientists because most are. So within all of that context, it was really helping them get the resources they needed, both from this weekly product we would put out on various timely topics, but also another bucket was the education. It was the workshops, it was the webinars, it was connecting them with experts so they could ask their direct questions and help learn. The difference between weather and climate models, the difference between data sets and how far back to go to trust and where to tease out when you QA, QC that data. All of this was a part of it. So in this process, move it along. In the earlier days of starting the program, one of the surveys Ed had put out, it was 54% of TV meteorologists were convinced the climate was changing. That was it. That was lower than public opinion at the time. A couple years later, really not that long later, it was 5 or 6 years later, that number got up to 95%. So we were able to move the community along. Now they can activate. And even though TV and news in general is changing, weather and extreme weather is one of the primary ways that people experience climate change. And so there's always going to be a role for helping people understand what these connections are, because it's a time when people are open to learning or open to listening, or at least their world has shifted and things are just different and a lot of their barriers are broken down. And so even though they're doing it on many different platforms right now, TV meteorologists or meteorologists in general are some still of the leading communicators on this.
I would just add 95% is statistically significant. So with that, I think we will, oh, Ed, if you had a quick comment, yep.
Yeah, because I had a chance to pitch the notion that to win the battle of hearts and minds, we need simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted and caring voices. That's how we got the weathercaster community to 95% acceptance of the scientific realities of climate change. The untrustworthy voices had been working on that community for over a decade before we came along, and we managed to unwind the trouble that they had made for us. But then the other formula or approach that I want you to keep in mind is once you've won the battle of hearts and minds and people realize I should be doing something differently, you still have more work to do, because you have to actually, just like all of us probably had New Year's resolutions this year and most of us failed, once people agree, once people decide they want to do something, it's in our best interest to help them do it. It isn't easy to change your behavior. So the whole Climate Matters program was targeting that 50% of the 54% of the weathercaster community who wanted to change their behavior. And I don't want to sound like we're bragging, but frankly, we've earned bragging rights. Reporting on climate change by broadcast meteorologists has increased 1,200% since we started this program. It was a virtual non-entity when we started, and now it really is what local TV weathercasters do. They put extreme weather in the context of global climate change. And so, but we understood that we had two battles. One was the battle for hearts and minds, and one was the battle for behavior change. And we waged those battles separately.
Great. So we end with a feel-good story, efficacy once again. Now we turn it over to you guys. So we will do a Q&A, and I think we've got a roving microphone here. So please, any questions that you have for our panelists? Allie.
I think that they're recording it though, so that's.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for sharing that really compelling success story of how you worked with meteorologists to change their reporting. I'm curious, in this day and age where I think fewer people are getting weather information from local broadcast TV, have you thought about ways that you might be able to incorporate this information about local impacts into, weather apps or other sources of information where people might be getting their weather news as opposed to from like this trusted voice?
Absolutely. So one of the things I said, that TV meteorologists were some of the first people to be on social media. So they are dominating a lot of the social media airwaves on that anyway. So a lot of that's happening. But the apps is a whole different story. And we have spoke with many different app providers in ways to make that connection, and it just really hasn't fully gone forward. You are most welcome to contact your app provider and tell them you would like to see climate information with your weather information. This is where I think that consumer demand can drive some of that, because there still is this sense of fear of bringing climate out from the big corporate spaces. And when they understand that people actually want it, this can move further, because there's a lot of ways. We had actually even created our own website years ago called Weather Shift, and it was everywhere there was weather, we gave the relevant climate connection. It was way too ahead of its time, and it does not exist anymore, but we have thought through the processes and how you can and which ways to do it.
One of our closest friends in the broadcast meteorology community is a man named John Morales. He broadcasts out of Miami, and he cried on air as a hurricane was bearing down on Miami a couple of years ago. It went viral. So, he is just one example of an influencer who, he was just a regular old broadcast meteorologist. And as he started doing this work, and, the fact that it happens in very intense emotional environments, like a hurricane bearing down in ways that could harm a lot of people in Miami. And so he let it get real, and he was rewarded. He was excoriated by some by it, but by and large, everybody saw what a hero this guy is, to be speaking the truth and really trying to help us understand the problems we face.
One quick point on that, because this is where, when we were talking about earlier, moments can create more moments. When that happened, not only was his station, in a beautiful way, sort of relinquished him to go do all the additional media, even though they were dealing with a hurricane, and they brought in other people, and that's rare. He has really gotten himself a good station there. But the other thing is, we have this global weather presenter community that we're all connected with on this really fun WhatsApp group, and it created these moments all around the world for people to go then talk about climate change, and then in other spaces in news too. So it created more moments to talk about it. And as a side note, John Morales does all of our Climate Matters translation and has since 2014. So everything we do is in Spanish for Spanish-speaking community.
Did he also do the translation for Bad Bunny? So questions, please. Shirley, we have two of the leading climate communication experts in the world right here. So please, yeah. Feel free to introduce yourself too.
I'm another postdoc at the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, and one topic that I work on is journalism. I used to be a former fact checker at factcheck.org. And I was quite surprised at your despondency about the role of journalism in solving this issue. And I would like to hear maybe some elaboration for that, why you think journalism isn't going to play a big role. Like, for example, an actionable change could be supporting more solid journalism, subscribing to newsletters or other journalistic outlets that, like, if funding is the biggest issue and we have extra money, then we can fund good journalism. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
I'm sorry that what I said hit you. You responded to it in that way, because that's not how I don't feel a sense of despair about climate journalism. Actually, I feel a great sense of climate optimism about climate journalism. There's so much room for improvement, and it's not just funding, but it's frankly funding and thinking about new ways of telling stories that reveal new sides of this and that help people develop a mental model of the problem, and even more importantly, a mental model of the solution set that is more in line with reality. I do think journalism can play an important role in that. The point I was trying to make, and it wasn't a point of despair, was that there are so many other voices that are ascending in their importance in the modern communication ecosystem, and I was just sort of like giving them a shout out.
Yeah, so where Ed sits on a lot of stuff too is trusted messengers, and a lot of his work goes with health professionals and others, and how in this really fragmented space, they've gotten way more of a bump in ways that are really beautiful. But as far as journalism goes, I still sit absolutely at this space of science and journalism and that being a path forward. And we were already having some interesting discussions earlier today about journalism and climate journalism. And it's interesting because sometimes groups like this, we really are focused on how to bend the climate curve and solve climate change. Journalism's role, as you know, but sometimes people confuse this, their role isn't necessarily to change behaviors. It's to report facts. And that's where there's this really fascinating intersection, because climate is so integrated into stories that are already being told, and it's not always called out. And when you really start to learn more about climate change, right, it leads to a whole host of more climate reporting. And that's where I've sat for the past 13 years, is in that space, and working with the journalism community. Now, the other thing I do want to call out when it comes to journalism is, even though, as we started to say earlier, the national numbers or global numbers on climate reporting have come down, the local numbers are on the rise, and that is where there still is an immense amount of trust. Even if the numbers overall with local news are going down, they're still some of the highest out there, and they bring a ton of value. And this is where we break down that global issue to really that personal local issue and how it affects you, what you can do about it. Not just, oh, heat, but this 100-degree temperature in my community, or 115 in Phoenix, or 80 in San Francisco, so you can really get local and personal on that. And there's still some of the leading ways in the world of journalism, as you know.
Okay, thanks. Great conversation there. We have time for one more question. Yeah, please. And again, feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Ty. I'm a dual master's student in environmental studies and nonprofit management. I used to work at an organization called Narrative 4, and we would connect people across difference using storytelling. And I tried to push the narrative of using this in the climate sector. And I've been thinking a lot about Catherine Hayhoe's work and talking about how divisions in our political system have been causing a lot of these this silence that we're talking about, and the role of third spaces in potentially increasing conversation with people who are different than you, and that can kind of build that trust and empathy. Has there been any work in the climate sector regarding third spaces and their role in potentially bridging that division?
Isn't that some of how, before I even started with Climate Matters, you did?
It's not coming to me.
Okay. I don't know if I'm answering this fully correctly.
I was just going to say, do you want to define for the audience what you mean by third spaces?
I'll do it, since I got a microphone. Third spaces are basically community locations where people get together and they talk. And so a dear friend of mine who runs a series of bookstores in Seattle called Third Place Books. They lose a lot of money. My friend is essentially a philanthropist by owning these bookstores, but he really believes strongly that bookstores can be a place where people can come together and talk about books and talk about other issues that are of importance in their community. And bookstores, libraries, to some degree barbershops, beauty salons, all kinds of places where people congregate, create, and talk about whatever it is they just talk about. They actually can be structured into interventions to encourage them to talk about things that they probably would like to be talking about, but otherwise probably aren't. Do I have that right? Yeah.
So maybe this is something you can do more of, and see how we can help. One this isn't complete, and I haven't heard about it recently, but there was Scientists and Pubs was like a series going around for a while, and
A
it
lot of
was,
cities and towns have this, yeah.
yeah, so that's one of those gathering places. I don't know if it's a structured intervention type thing, but it's a gathering around something different.
Garden clubs.
Yes, and so then garden clubs is another great one too, and so that C-change conversation, C-change conversations.
Rotary as well, right?
And Rotaries, yeah. So there are some of these groups. So the Sea Change Conversations group, you can go to their website too. They're absolutely amazing. It was a host of ladies in Princeton who were in their garden club, had gone to the National Garden Clubs, and the way they describe it does it so much more justice than I will. But they were talking about their pearl wearing pumps, and they heard about climate change, and they're like, why are we not doing more about this? And so they started by hosting these broader conversations. They'd bring in experts to someone's home in Princeton and have an event around it and have cocktails. And then it got to a point that they created this primer, this 101. Now they go out around the country to invited sessions where they can have this primer conversation on climate change.
We're going to go just a minute long, yes.
Because I so love your question, I actually want to, my final words are going to be about the importance of telling a good story. And I know that Joe actually loves something that I sometimes say, which is that numbers numb, but stories sell. You know, we in climate communication, we tend to use a lot of numbers, but they don't tend to land very well. But stories often do land. So the story I want to close with is the story of a man named Burpee, Mr. Burpee, who started a seed company in the late part of the 18th century. And Mr. Burpee was selling essentially lawn seeds. He was trying to import the idea of the English lawn as what American homes should look like. And he told his salesmen, they were all men back then, he said, don't talk to your customers about our seeds, talk to them about their lawns. Bam.
All right, well, on that, I don't think we could end on a better note there. So let's thank our two panelists here once again.
Thank you.